Welcome to the Why We Advocate podcast. I'm your host, Jasmine Uribe, and joining us today is Arely Hernandez, Nova's Associate Director of Campus Advocacy, and Catherine Thompson, D-SAACP Credentialing Specialist and Training Coordinator. We're excited to talk all about advocacy and how Nova makes connections with communities in trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and community and survivor-centered ways. Today's episode is going to explore the strategies to engage advocates working on college campuses and how Nova supports advocates to build their leadership to respond to emerging trends and support that student survivors need. So let's dive right in. Hi, Arely and Catherine. How are you doing?
Hi, Jasmine. We're doing well. Thank you
Great.
for having us.
I'm so excited to have you here. So can you tell me more about what the role of campus advocacy is when it comes to supporting student survivors of violence?
Again, to me, that means first and foremost, putting students first. So providing student-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally relevant support that guides students through what is often a complex and intimidating and sometimes confusing process that is also very unique to their particular university. Key role that I think campus advocates play is in prevention education. Since students often come from diverse backgrounds, a school's campus advocacy program may be their first interaction in learning about violence and violence prevention.
Yes, I hear that. Oftentimes, I hear from students who are on campus that they didn't know what sexual violence really was until they heard about it on campus. And at that point, you can think college students typically between the ages of 18 to 25, that's a long time to not hear about all those rights and what violence really is. So thank you for explaining that. Arely, did you have more to add?
I just wanted to say it also allows them to put words to what they may be feeling or have been going through, right? And so violence is not necessarily a piece where that they haven't been impacted. We've all been impacted by violence at one point before we even step foot on campus, right? And there's a research that talks about that about 50% of folks of the students that are on campus have already experienced violence before setting foot to the institution. So for a campus advocate to be supportive, and their role is to acknowledge that students already come with some type of trauma, that they've already been victimized. And so it's important that this service meets the students where they're at. And so for me, that's another piece of the role of how advocates and the advocacy program can support survivors.
Yes, meeting students where they are at. I'm sure we'll say that and you'll hear it many times in this episode. And it really is true. It goes beyond assuming what you think you know about students and really listening to what they're telling you. Okay, so when I think about campus and support for students, I'm thinking about victim services. So in some way, someone has experienced some harm, some violence, whether it's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, some form of violence, and they're on campus and they need some support. But how do victim services, Arely, if you want to take this one, how do victim services differ from community-based services?
Right. And that's a really great question. And that, Jasmine, is a question that we get very often because although they are very similar, right, a lot of them provide case management, accompaniment, etc. One of the biggest difference is that campus victim services understands the different complexities of the mandates that institutions must abide, such as Title IX, the Clery Act, the Campus Safe Act, and so many more. And so the campus victim services and the advocates must understand the bureaucracy and help support students as they navigate this process. And so that is one of the advantages, right? Knowing that if a student needs accommodations, this individual in the role will know who to go to or will know that process instead of delaying it or not understanding it fully, which can cause additional trauma to our student survivor. And so also there are many campuses who have medical services as well, for example. And so that can also lead to additional support on their campus where many students feel comfortable seeking that service, right? And so as a campus victim service, the goal is to strive to be confidential and to strive to provide a service that students feel comfortable coming to. And once you manage to create those reports with the students, they will come and they will seek that support that will be unique to them and that will again meet their needs, right? But at the same time, the advocate and in their role will help them navigate that process to reduce re-traumatization and to reduce re-victimizing them again in that setting. So it's important, right, to have both. I believe those partnerships are valuable with our community-based services, which allows students to have options as well. But if we have them on our campus where students feel safe, feel comfortable going to, that is their first step into seeking that help into their healing recovery.
And you mentioned so many important aspects of connecting with student survivors and connecting with students in general. It's building that rapport. And Catherine said this earlier about tailoring programs to the students' needs, diverse needs. You mentioned, Areli, access needs. If a student is maybe a survivor with disabilities, what type of accessibility needs do they need? Do they require, right? So I'm really curious to have you all share a little bit more about why it's so important to tailor victim advocacy to the needs of students, and how can our campus-based professionals strengthen their efforts to do so?
I would say that it's important to tailor the victim advocacy to the specific community that you're serving. So, because students study and socialize and often live on campus, like that is their community. And they also may be located in an area, maybe it's a rural area that might not have very well resource community-based services. So the campus victim services play a really key role in filling that gap for them. And the campus-based professionals really need to have a robust understanding of the intersectional needs of their student, including academic support, if they have housing, making sure they have housing stability, and understanding of the different social and emotional impacts that they may be experiencing. And they need to have a ability to work closely with the institution to provide the students with the safety plan that includes all of these different needs.
And if I may add really quickly, also, I think it's important to tailor victim advocacy to the needs of the survivor because trauma impacts us all differently. And so we also need to understand that violence brings so many other factors and layers into a person's lives. And it not only impacts them emotionally or psychologically or even physically, right? Usually when we talk about violence, we think about physical harm, physical abuse, but it also impacts them mentally and it also impacts them academically. So when we talk about college students, we're also talking about their impact with their academics. Now we're dealing with their education. And so a lot of and we've seen this in research, right? Many of the students drop out as a result of them being victimized. And so this is why victim services is important to be tailored, because we want to continue to keep them on campus. We want them to be successful, not only in their personal lives, not only in their healing process, but also academically. And that is one of the differences, also referencing back to the previous question, Jasmine, that you mentioned, is campus-based advocacy services also assist students in graduating, right? The retention rate and bringing them and keeping them is very important and vital. So if you're a campus, you want to think about this as a budget, maybe a financial piece. If you have folks on your campus, you're bringing in revenue. If people drop out, you're losing, right? You're losing money. And so right now, unfortunately, that's one of the biggest impacts on our campus is money, is our funds. So how can we support students to continue to come back, especially student survivors, is having these services available to them, having these accommodations being accessible to them, because that is how we want to ensure that not only we keeping them, but they're successful and they're thriving on their campus, right? Which is, again, the important piece of having it tailored to their needs. But I also want to address the second piece of your question, which is how can campus-based professionals strengthen their skills? And so one of the things that we have, of course, here at NOVA is we have a unique academy, the NOVA's Campus Advocacy Training, which we host every winter. And this year is no different. We will be hosting it starting January through March. And this is a 7-week program where advocates come together from across the nation and learn from experts in the field and other campus advocates as well about the trends that are happening, how to serve students in historically marginalized populations, students with disabilities, how to navigate, safety, planning, accommodations, confidentiality, and privacy, which is a huge piece of the advocacy work, and many, many other more important topics that advocates on campus need to learn and understand in order for them to better support their students, but also to support the campus in liability and compliance, right? I think that's the main piece of making sure that institutions are compliant. And so I think that's an important aspect that campus advocates can definitely strengthen their skills and understanding how the institution navigates. But I also want to make sure that advocates understand that it's important for them to have self-care. This work is very hard. This work is very difficult, and it burns people out. Trust me, I was in that role a few years ago, and it really takes a toll on your emotional and psychological well-being. And so understanding that one of the skills we also need to learn and implement, because sometimes we know it, but we just don't do it, is how to take care of ourselves. And I know that self-care, that word gets thrown around very easily, but really fully understanding what that means, not only for ourselves, but also for our families, right? For our community. What does that care look like? That goes beyond maybe just a cup of wine or a bar of chocolate, right? But really, really understanding what it means for us to recharge and come back and meet our students where they're at. I would tell my advocates, we can't give what we don't have, right? And that's an important piece in the work that we do when we support survivors on our campuses.
Thanks so much, Catherine and Areli. You're giving me lots of thoughts. Yes, of course, self-care is important. Wellness is important because I often think, when we are in help service careers, when maybe for some of us, for all of our lives, we've always been the helper. Oldest daughter here speaking. As an eldest daughter and someone who's a first grandchild, so all the perks, I was the first of many. And you always feel like you have to care and help others, but you can't help others if you're not helping yourself first. And that is not something that we really think about, especially when we're in careers that give so much. And I'm pretty sure there are campus advocates who are listening to this, or advocates working in other spaces that are like, yeah, self-care is important, but have you really practiced it? Like beyond taking a walk, like what truly are you doing to recharge and reset? Because this work is tiring. This work can be exhausting, but it's also important. And there was something else you said, Aurelia, about, for college campuses. And I worked a lot in K through 12 education with students who were experiencing dating violence and other sexual harassment, other forms of violence and abuse. I heard this in the middle school system a lot, where you think, oh, dating violence isn't happening with our young youth, our teens, our 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds. I'm sorry, parents, newsflash, they are dating in whatever form they define dating as. It's not, they don't call it dating. But with the principals, I was like, well, if student enrollment is important, then prevention education needs to be important too. So on the college level, if you are a president who's really looking at those student enrollment numbers, if you are a board of institutions of higher education that are really focused on how do we drive our student numbers and retention, give them solid victim services. Student enrollment and victim services go hand in hand. There are many students who, if they see that victim services are accessible, if they see that they're inclusive, they're more likely to engage. And then that increases, yes, maybe reports of harm, but it also increases your opportunities to support and help them live sustainable, healthier lives. So, okay,
Yeah.
I'll get off my soapbox. I'm sure the advocates are listening. They're like, yes, Jasmine, yes, Adeli. But if you care about student enrollment, you should care about victim services. And I know many people do care, but it's often the how that is left for question. So in an ideal environment, right, what would an ideal campus advocacy victim services program look like, and how can we encourage our campuses to move closer to that model? So
I think a ideal program really is depending on, the program of that particular school would need to be well staffed according to their population size. A small school will need different will have different staffing needs than a much larger university, maybe a university that has majority students living on campus versus having a large commuting population. If they have multiple campuses, those will all look slightly different, but the ideal program will be a confidential and safe place for students to not only seek services, but be able to ask questions, engage in prevention efforts. This program would have meaningful partnerships with different student groups, having student liaisons and involving them in campus programming and events, and their staff would be reflective of the student population so that they can develop those meaningful relationships.
And if I may add, I think campuses can move closer to that model, right? It doesn't take a lot to do that. It really it's looking at who's already there and making some adjustments. So for example, when we talk about confidentiality and privacy, look at, what is the policy saying and who can this institution designate as being a confidential individual for Title IX, for Clery, etc. Right? There's already folks on the campus who can be designated, and that doesn't cost anything. That's just a quick little change. I know that some of our legal folks that are hearing this their heads are probably like, oh my God, no, because we want a blanket of folks to be responsible employees under Title IX. But you have that ability to assign folks and to designate them as non-responsive employees, which we're all responsive employees, right? But under Title IX, they're not mandated to report, right? And so I think that is one step that campus individuals can look into having this. Also, building those collaborations and partnerships that Catherine talked about earlier. Getting outside of our offices and having, those informal chats, let's have a chat over coffee and let's take a walk and let's talk about how we can collaborate and integrate, violence prevention, integrate our services into existing programs already. And so what can our offices do to integrate this prevention piece into other things that are happening on our campus? How can we create a poster or some type of informational marketing piece that can be placed in our residential homes, can be placed in, the buildings of our colleges of education, the College of Liberal Arts, maybe the professor can add, or provide extra credit for students to attend a domestic violence awareness event. And so together, we can build this model. It just takes effort. It takes time. But we have that. And I think as campus employees, and as a previous also campus advocate, I know that our goal is to keep our campus safe, right? We have that in the middle of everything that we do and in the work that we do is we're passionate for student success. And student success is part of their safety and their well-being. So integrating those into that lens also will help campuses move closer into having or establishing an ideal campus advocacy program. And if you have any other questions on how to do it, please feel free to reach out to us. Catherine and I are more than happy to have a conversation, jump on a Zoom call, on a phone call, send us an email, and we're more than happy to brainstorm ideas based off what you already have, right? Build off of what your campus has, what your community has as well, because you also want to integrate your community into this model.
Thanks so much, Arely. Yes, yes. And talking about community integration, there's one piece of this puzzle that I know I did a few years of work on, and it's a passion of all of us here at Nova and so many of our listeners. But when we talk about thinking about community, thinking about culture, thinking about meeting students where they are, what are some ways that campuses can ensure that their victim services and their campus advocacy programs are culturally responsive? So we talked about, you mentioned students within residence, right? Res halls. When I think about culture, I know that it goes beyond racial and ethnic identity. There's so many different cultures on campus. Catherine, you mentioned before, like rural students on rural campuses. And I know confidentiality when your campus is maybe 100 or less than 200 students can be really hard. So how do we create those culturally inclusive programs, if there's any tips or any student populations that you want to talk more about. And I know also language access and is really important here too. So beyond everyone's assumptions of what diversity and culture means, what else can you give our audience in terms of giving them the skills to create more inclusive, culturally responsive programs?
That's a great question, Jasmine. I think we talk about, making sure that all of our services are tailored and they meet our students' needs. And I think these words, inclusive and culturally responsive and diversity, those are right now hot topics. But there's many opportunities for the campus to be inclusive and to be diverse and to be culturally sensitive to the student survivors' needs. And one of those that I recommend is to be intentional. Be intentional in the actions that you are taking. Be intentional in the offices or the departments that you're seeking that support or that you're seeking that partnership, right? Because students know who they can trust and they know who they cannot trust. And I put this example as, so I don't know if you all know about this webpage, like, something about like, tell me about the faculty member. Students go in there and they chat about faculty members and they'll spill the tea on who's a good faculty member, who's not, right? And so it's very similar to the services that we have on our campus. Students will let you know, hey, don't go to that office, or hey, don't go talk to that person because they say one thing, but their actions reflect something different. And so as campus advocates or in a role where we support survivors, it's important to be intentional in seeking out those partnerships and seeking out those collaborations. But also it's important to seek out student survivors' voice and to elevate their voices, of course, with consent, right? And so establishing those relationships with students who have been in that process or who understand, right, what it means to be a survivor, and getting to know about getting their feedback as to what could we improve. There's always opportunities for improvement. As staff members, we may think we know it all, but in reality, we probably don't, right? And so we want to make sure that our students provide us that feedback, that they give us, right, that opportunity for us to learn from them so we can make those improvements and we can modify and that we are able to better serve them. So for example, there were moments where when I was working as a campus advocate, we weren't able to communicate with students via email, right? Why? Well, we realized they don't read emails. I think they still don't. I don't know. But even probably me, I probably didn't even read fully my emails. So how would I expect students to read their emails, right? And so we ended up contracting with a text message service that was private and confidential, and that would send out those text message, right? About, hey, we're here to support you, or hey, there's this, you have an appointment coming up, very, very broad. It didn't have, the information of the office. It was just the logo of the institution. You have an appointment, and that was about it. And so students were more receptive to that text message than they were to an email or even a call, right? And so we started to notice that folks were coming to their appointments, that they were coming to their follow-ups. And so that was one innovation that was done in this area to ensure that we were targeting students where they were at. And so I think those are very minor steps that we can take, is building, right, our networks, building our collaborations. We cannot do this work alone. It's impossible to do this work alone. And so we have to also ensure that our staff is diverse, that our staff reflects our student population. And I know sometimes it's difficult, but hiring folks that are bilingual, hiring folks that feel comfortable speaking the language that is most common on your campus. And if you don't know what maybe the top 3 common languages on your campus, then I encourage you to find that out, right? It's important for us to know what are your top 3 languages spoken on your campus from your students. And also, we mentioned having written and digital materials that are in different languages, but also having ASL software and platforms. And for students that are hard of hearing or for students that are blind, we want to make sure that they also have access to the resources and to the support that the campus has for them.
That's great, Arely. And And it's about building the programs from the start, right? So if I'm a student, let's say, who needs ASL interpretation, am I going to feel more comfortable when I see ASL interpreters available? Or am I going to feel more comfortable when I have to say, how do I even ask, right? Share that information at the beginning. Have materials in multiple languages. The fun challenge you gave our campus advocates, do you know the top 3 languages spoken on your campus? That many of you may be able to answer that, but if you don't, it's easy to find that information. Look at your student demographics, look at your reporting, and have the materials available in those languages. So a survivor who's already dealing with the amount of stress it took them and the amount of courage it took them to go through to even come to the point and say, I'm going to seek out help. Let's minimize that stress and encourage them by having the resources available in as simple as languages or in terms that will be relevant. I always share this story. I didn't know that I experienced dating violence until I read intimate partner violence in a textbook. Even then, those 3 words, intimate partner violence, didn't mean anything to me until I read the definition. So I'm not saying you have to use all the colloquial terms and TikTok language or whatever new social media is out there, but be mindful of how formal your content is, because that may turn away a survivor as well. Because then beyond, can you speak my language? It's, can you relate to me? And you mentioned that, Catherine, too, having staff that reflect the student populations. And even if you aren't from the student demographic, racial, ethnic background, cultural background, do you have the cultural humility to understand people's worldviews? Do you have the ability to say, this is not my own experience, but let me hear your experience? Or are you just saying, well, I'm not familiar, so let me just go about the way that I think it should be done? Because then you're not listening to survivors. So yes, okay, another soapbox moment, but it is so important. I think when I work with students, I think about, where would a student be turned away? Or a survivor who already said, okay, I'm taking the courage to speak out. That they're already miles ahead of what many survivors would even do. So many survivors stay silent. So what can I do to stop them from being turned away because I simply didn't think about their needs? So I always think about that. I challenge myself, like, if I was going down this path as a student on campus, what would I need to see to feel like this campus should earn my trust and I feel safe here?
I agree, Jasmine. Going back to the jargon that you mentioned about the legal terms or utilizing, high academic verbiage into our marketing pieces, I think we also have to make sure that we're bringing it down to that level. And and you're right, when we see that language, we're not going to go because I don't understand what you're saying. One of the things that I realized when I was working as a campus advocate is a lot of our students that would come in our doors, they would not see themselves as victims. They would not allow us to call them victims. Or when we would tell them you were a victim, you could see it in their body language that it was rejected. And so one of the things we started implementing was asking them, we use the words here, victim or survivor. How do you want me to address you? A lot of times they would tell me, address me by my name. I don't want to use neither terms. And that's okay. And by us asking them just that one simple question, it gave them that autonomy to make a decision, and it empowered them to make a decision. Because when we're talking about violence, especially domestic or dating violence, their autonomy to make decisions has been removed. And so by us allowing them to make that one decision, we're slowly empowering them to feel that they are able to make those decisions into their healing journey, right? And to start that journey. And so a simple question of, how do you want me to address you, can go a long ways, right? And so when we bring these policies, or when we bring this to their level, they'll be more receptive to continuing to seek the service out.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Aurelie said about intentionality being extremely important. You don't want to be checking boxes and say like, oh, we're providing the service and we had this event, and so we're done. We did what we needed to do. But did, how many people attended that event? What were the students' takeaways from that event? Are they really benefiting from what you're offering the way that you intend for them to. So intentionality, making sure that what you're offering is being received by the students in a positive and productive way. Again, what I really mentioned about just having written and digital materials, ensuring they have that inclusive language and information that is culturally relevant. If, asking for feedback, and if they aren't being well received, being able to pivot and adapt to the feedback of your student population.
You can be intentional, but would you know your intentionality is landing? How would you know that? Ask for feedback. Just because we feel like I'm being totally intentional, this is a great way to approach it. If it's not landing with the students that you're trying to serve, then it's really not meeting their needs. So reassessing, reflecting, asking for feedback, all of those are great, great nuggets of ways that campuses can be more responsive to students in need. Okay, so we're reaching the end of our little segment here because I know we can keep talking. And I encourage our audience members, if you have more questions, reach out to the TA team here at Nova, reach out to our campus team, and we'll put the contact information in our description. But reach out if you want to have more conversations like this, because sometimes it just takes talks like this to spark some opportunities for improvement or to strengthen what you already have. I know Nova's big commitment is really to uplift and amplify the work of our communities. We are helping you all make the connection. We're helping you all strengthen your efforts, and we really want to be partners in that. So with that, I want to close. Our podcast is named the Why We Advocate podcast. And I always like to ask this last question. What is your why when it comes to this work?
So my why is that I believe that all students have the right to learn and grow and complete their education without the threat of violence. And campus advocates play an essential role in interrupting the cycle of violence and creating healthier future generations by cultivating a safe campus culture through trauma-informed care and preventative measures. My why when this comes to this work is also what brought me to Nova. Nova can provide the resources and tools for campus programs to achieve this goal. Like we mentioned earlier, NCAT, that was my personal introduction to the field of campus advocacy as well. And I learned so much about topics of confidentiality and about ethics. Title IX and the Clery Act, which I could not wrap my head around before NCAT, but our wonderful instructors delivered the material in such a clear and understandable way. We talked about restorative justice and how to develop effective prevention initiatives. And we had attendees who came with absolutely no experience, and they were trying to, enter the field and find a job at a university. And then we also had advocates with 10 years of experience, and they all had such wonderful feedback about NCAT, and it's really strengthened my understanding of my why and why I do this work and why I advocate.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a really hard one to follow. And that's a heavy question, Jasmine, because my why extends across my lifespan, hitting both professional and personal. And so for me, my why is for the future. Right. I see the students on our college campuses as our future. I see the students from K through 12 as our future, right? And it's important that we create an environment, as Catherine mentioned, that is violent-free. And that would be my goal, is to have a campus, a violence-free world. And if I don't have a job, then that means we did our work, right? If we don't have a job, then we accomplished our goal and we met them. But we also understand and see the statistics, and we can't be blind about that. And so for me, again, my why is for the future. I have 2 teenagers that are upcoming college students in the near future, and I don't want them. Of course, we don't want none of our students to go through this, but we know, again, looking at statistics, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, depending what you read, will be victims of sexual violence on our campus. And so I want my daughters to know that there is support there. I want them to get involved. I want them to be, that support for someone else who is reaching out and who has experienced this. I want, the future to be bright for everyone. And so my why is making sure that folks understand that we can create these amazing campus advocacy models that are tailored to our students and also help prevent the next violence crime on our campus. And so Nova has, right, the opportunity to be a partnership with you all in creating this model that looks best on your campus. And as Jasmine mentioned, we are here to support you all in those endeavors because we all have our different whys, we all have our reasons. And whether it's professional, whether it's personal, whether it is both, right, our goal is always to be able to provide or to have an environment that is violent free and safe for any individual that steps foot on our campus community.
Well said, well said. Well, I learned so much today. I hope our audience members did too. And yes, National Campus Advocacy Training registration is open now through December 22nd, 2025. If you aren't a NOVA member, this is a good time to become a NOVA member because NOVA members do receive discount registration for the Academy. And I'm so happy to hear, Catherine, I think this might have been the first time I heard that this was your first introduction, the NCAT training. I heard from actually a conference attendee that they first heard about NOVA through NCAT and then they attended conference. So you are not alone if you're a campus advocate. We're here to support you. Come join a network, learn more about campus advocacy or strengthen your skills and bring your team on. So yes, NCAT is there. We talk lots about the trends for students, the support that we need for students, and I'm sure we can keep this conversation going. So reach out to Aurelia and Catherine if you need any support. This concludes our podcast episode for the Why We Advocate podcast. Hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much for joining.